Okay, so we're moving on to our last component, our last section of lecture 3, which is sexual orientation and how does that develop and where does that come from? What's our understanding of it? So, of course, your sexual orientation is the genders of people to whom you are attracted and or with whom you tend to be romantically interested in or form sexual relationships with, right? So who do you want to date? Who do you want to be with romantically or sexually? And we tend to define this in terms of how their gender relates to our own personal gender, right? So our definitions would be that heterosexual, remember hetero means different than, so attracted to people of the opposite sex or gender. Homosexual, homo meaning same, attracted to people of the same gender or sex. And then bisexual, meaning two, right? I'm attracted to both, for example. But all of these kind of assume, again, that binary gender configuration, right? That you can only be one or the other and not somewhere in between. So that's a little bit limiting, right? Like if you're a transgender person, which gender do you use for this definition, right? So it gets really kind of messy and weird once we kind of look at all the variety of genders and biologic sexes that exist. So a more kind of inclusive term that's often used is pansexual, right? So that's like, well, it doesn't really matter necessarily what their biologic sex or gender identity is, right? You're attracted to the person for who they are, right? Not necessarily their body parts or what gender they identify with. And some people actually are asexual, so they're just not sexually attracted to people. They might be romantically interested in people, right? But romance is different from sex. Sometimes they're related, right? But not always. Okay, so those are just some examples and the kind of biggest definitions that you'll need to know for this class. So sexual orientation is interesting, and it wasn't anything that was scientifically studied until the 1950s, till Alfred Kinsey published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, right? And this was this book that he wrote based on interviews that he conducted with hundreds and hundreds of men all around the country. And what he found was that a lot of guys had had other sexual experiences with other guys, right? And he was like, and people aren't talking about this. And actually, there's this kind of huge range of sexuality. And it's kind of interesting because Kinsey himself, he was trained as an entomologist. He studied insects, gall wasps, in fact. And so he was very familiar with this idea that nature doesn't always create discrete categories of this and or this, right? That oftentimes there's a spectrum with lots of variety and differences. And so he found, yeah, a lot of guys actually had some level of same-sex attraction or even a history of experiences with other men. And so I like this quote, that he says, males do not represent two discrete populations, heterosexual and homosexual. The world is not to be divided into sheep and goats. It is a fundamental of taxonomy, right? He's referring to his kind of biology training here, that nature rarely deals with discrete categories, right? It's not always just one thing or one other thing, right? The living world is a continuum in each and every one of its aspects. So again, getting to that idea that sexuality is kind of on a spectrum. And so he developed this Kinsey scale. And so what we see on the left-hand side is a Kinsey 0. Those are people who are exclusively heterosexual. They're only interested in people of the opposite gender or sex. Their only experiences and behaviors are with people of the opposite gender or sex. And then Kinsey 6, all the way on the other end, right? So they are exclusively homosexual. They're like, oh my gosh, I would never date, a person of the other gender or sex. And I've had no experience with that and I have no interest in it, right? But then there are all these places in between, right? So you kind of have these varying levels of what are often termed kind of the middle sexualities, of being like, maybe a Kinsey 1 is, well, I'm usually straight, but I'd kiss Angelina Jolie, right? Or something like that, right? It's like, well, if they were really attractive or something, then maybe I would be interested. Whereas a 3, right, on the Kinsey scale would be something like, no, I'm equally attracted to men and women. right? So that would be kind of like solidly bisexual. So there's this kind of scale idea. And so how does that kind of fit against what we see currently in the population is an interesting question. I think I have a slide with a little information for you first. Yep. So this is just a little data about Kinsey's reports and kind of what he found in terms of what percentages of men and women rated, a 3 or a 5 to a 6, right? And this was actually very like controversial at the time. People were like all aflutter about this because he was like, look, a lot of people are gay or lesbian, and that really hadn't been talked about before, and it certainly hadn't been studied in any kind of scientific way. So anyway, so what do we see these days? So this is a study where they asked people, so they in the kind of bluer bar, you see all US adults, and then in the green, you see younger people. This is actually a study, you can't see it because my head's in the way, from 2015, and they asked people how they identified. And what you can see is that among the younger generation, only about 64% said they were totally straight, right? Exclusively heterosexual. I have a chart with some more recent data. So this one is from 2019. And again, separating out kind of by age group because, again, culture and social norms change, right? So if we look at the baby boomers at the bottom of this, right? So 78% of them say, oh, no, I'm totally straight, right? But 13% are somewhere in the middle, right? So Kinsey 1 through 5, and 7% of them are like, no, I'm like completely gay or lesbian. Right. And then if we look at my generation, Gen X, right, only 65% of us are like, oh, I'm totally straight. And then when we look at your generation, right, so millennials and Gen Z, fewer than half say, oh, I'm totally exclusively straight, right? So there's come to be this acceptance that there really is kind of a spectrum of sexuality, right? You can be attracted to lots of people for lots of different reasons, and that their body parts or gender might not always be the biggest distinguishing thing. And even if it is, there's a lot of in between here. It's really a spectrum. All right. So again, coming to this nature versus nurture idea, right? Are you born this way or is it because of how you were raised? So much of the 20th century, so the 1900s, thanks to Freud and many other pioneers in psychology and their legacies, was based on trying to figure out what turned people gay, right? And being homosexual was actually classified as a disorder. It was classified as a mental disorder. You were unhealthy, you were diseased. And so there was a lot of interest in trying to figure out, well, what made you this way? In large part because then it was like, well, how can we unmake you, right? How can we make you straight? So there were a lot of really interesting theories out there. Primary one was that homosexual men had really domineering mothers and weak fathers, and that made them gay, or that lesbian women had unloving mothers and absent fathers, or that people who are homosexual hated or feared members of the opposite sex. And you'll often still kind of hear that idea today of that, oh, lesbians are just man haters, right? Which is not true. Just because they don't want to have sex with them doesn't mean they hate them, right? And then there's also another idea that still persists today, even though it's been shown to not be true, that people who are homosexual got turned gay because they were sexually assaulted or molested by same-sex adults, and that turned them gay, right? So that idea of, the altar boy who was sexually assaulted by a male priest, and then that turned him gay. And it's interesting, actually, when you follow out survivors of child sexual abuse, which of course is a terribly damaging thing to an individual, but they are no more likely to be gay or straight, depending on the sex or gender of their abuser, than anybody else, right? So there's no evidence to support this idea. There's also a final idea that gay people are more likely to have a gay mother or father. That doesn't actually seem to be true, although sometimes it does seem to kind of run in families, but probably what we're seeing is not whether it's there or not, but whether the person is open about it, right? So these are a lot of old theories that people spend a lot of time studying and trying to prove. And actually they found that they're all false, right? So I'm just gonna wash them out. None of them have held up under further scrutiny. There's another idea that says, well, you know what, it has to be part of how you're raised, because there are some countries where there are no gay people. And in fact, the president of Chechnya said not too long ago, when he was accused of murdering and torturing gay people, that that couldn't be happening in his country because there are no gay people in his country, for example. So it is true that ethnographers, people who study different cultures, have gone into different cultures and different countries and found that they can see no evidence that homosexuality exists. So I have these flags here, and maybe you've been wondering why I have these particular flags here. If we were in class, I'd ask you to guess. But it turns out that all of the countries that are kind of pictured here are countries where they have the death penalty for being gay, right? So imagine I'm an ethnographer, I have my clipboard, and I come and I knock on your door and I say, excuse me, I'm collecting data for a study. Are you gay? Right? If you live in a country where you could then be arrested, jailed, or put to death, you're probably going to say no, right? So just because people won't say that they're gay, or you cannot find any evidence of people engaging in same-sex behavior, does not mean that it isn't true or that it isn't happening, right? So there might be really good reasons why you don't seem to see it in some other cultures. Right? It might just be hidden, right? So in general, when we talked about gender identity, if you see something in multiple different, if it keeps coming up in lots of different cultures, then you think, well, maybe this is just part of human experience, right? But so what they're trying to argue here is that if you don't see it everywhere, then it's a result of culture. It's something that's learned rather than something that's innate. But unfortunately, because in some of these places there are very harsh penalties and a lot of fear and stigma associated with being homosexual, we can't really rely on evidence from those places as being valid, unfortunately. All right, so, and it was just a year ago that India made it not illegal to be gay, right? So it used to be punishable by up to 10 years in prison just for like kissing a guy if you were a guy, right? So that's a pretty strong motivator to stay in the closet, right? Even in countries where it's not illegal, right, there can still be intense social and cultural pressures to try to stay in the closet, or to not be gay, or to not act gay or homosexual or lesbian, right? And we still see that even in our own country today, depending on what area you are in, what types of communities you are a part of. There's another theory that's in your book, which is the only reason that I'm talking about it, because I think it actually seems a little bit ridiculous, but I'll explain it to you because you might be like, what, when you read it in the textbook. So, and she's from Cornell, the researcher, and I used to work there, and I don't know. But anyway, so they noticed that people who grow up to be gay or lesbian have a history of engaging in what would be considered more gender nonconforming play as children when compared to people who grew up to be straight or heterosexual. So then they were like, well, maybe if you play with boys, you end up being attracted to girls. And if you play with girls, you end up being attracted to boys. So maybe there's something about the other that's mysterious and exciting, right? And so if they're not the kids you're used to playing with, they're the kids you're excited about. So this theory that opposite gender play is what makes you homosexual, right? But it's like, well, wait, how do we know that like you tended to play with those kids just because you were already gay and you just felt more comfortable playing with those kids, right? So it's like, chicken before the egg. I thought it was kind of weird, so I thought it was worth mentioning. All right, finally, again, this argument for nurture that you can change it, that you can change your sexual orientation through counseling and other therapies, many of which are religious-based. And you can understand why there would be a lot of interest and motivation to do this, because many religions teach that being homosexual or being gay is a sin, right? And so they want very much then for it to be something that somebody can change. And the person who themselves is gay or lesbian, in order to stay a member of that community, would be very motivated to try to change, right? And to become not a sinner and to become an accepted member of the group. So there has actually been a lot of work trying to figure out ways to help change people's sexual orientation and to make them straight so that they are no longer sinning, so that they are no longer going against the religion. And so it's been going on for long enough now, and with enough research into it, that we can actually say very conclusively that it doesn't work. At best, so when you look at the studies, the best that they're ever able to achieve is abstinence, right? So the best that they can achieve, so say a guy is gay and like his church says that's not okay. The best that they're able to achieve is that he stops having sex with other men, that he stops kissing other men. In none of the studies were they ever able to get rid of the desires or interest itself, right? The only thing they were able to do is to kind of help somebody not act on their desires. And so unfortunately, that can be really harmful to people, especially because if this is just who they are, right? And you're telling that who they are is, perhaps an abomination, that can be really damaging to an individual's psyche. So again, all of the major mental health professional organizations have looked at the evidence on this and have said that this is ineffective and it's potentially harmful. So it's actually unethical to do this. And so there are a lot of people who have actually been really harmed by attempts at conversion therapy. Sometimes it's very harsh and even equates to torture, right? To try to kind of condition people out of their same-sex attractions. So it still happens, unfortunately, even though a lot of states have made it illegal, because that's actually how harmful and unethical it is. But so anyway, there we have it. Interestingly, some of the biggest opponents to this conversion therapy are people who used to lead the movement themselves, actually. And they've kind of come out and said, this is all a sham, and I'm still gay, and I used to say that I was the example of how you can change. And so we have really good evidence that this doesn't work, which is hard for people if then it means that they can't be accepted by their religious community, right? That's hard. So what about evidence to suggest that sexual orientation is innate, right? So we don't have a lot of evidence to support that it's learned, that it's how you were raised. So what evidence do we have to suggest maybe it's how you're wired and it's just how you are? So again, we have some dimorphic areas of the brain. So, and again, in the hypothalamus, a slightly different part of it. But what's interesting is that if you look at certain parts of the hypothalamus, they do seem to kind of code for your sexual orientation in the following way. So people who are attracted to women tend to have this dense staining region in the third interstitial nucleus. I'll never ask you for that. Whereas people who are attracted to men, whether they be male-bodied or female-bodied or male-identified or female-identified people, their brain tends to stain a different way if they are attracted to men, right? So again, evidence in the brain that there are structural differences present that seem to determine your sexual orientation in terms of what types of people you find attractive. There's this correlation with other biologic traits, right, that kind of suggest that if these things go together, right, then they're biologic, right? It's just part of how people are put together. So one is handedness. So lesbian women are a lot more likely to be left-handed than heterosexual women. And gay men are more likely to be left-handed than straight men as well. Now, it certainly doesn't mean if you're left-handed, you are gay or lesbian. And it certainly doesn't mean if you're gay or lesbian and you're not left-handed that, oh my gosh, you're not gay. No, not at all, right? But it's just kind of interesting. It's also interesting because we used to think that handedness could also be changed, right? So many years ago, they used to just try to do basically conversion therapy on people who were lefties to try to get them to write with their right hands. And as you might imagine, that did not work. There's this other thing about the index to ring finger ratio. So if you hold up your hand and you kind of look right? So if you kind of look at it, in male-bodied people, usually the what is it? Oh yeah, it's your index finger to your ring finger, right? So not your middle finger, but those two other ones, right? So in male-bodied people, the ring finger tends to be a little bit higher than the index finger, right? But in lesbians, we tend to see that pattern as well, right? So where you can see the ring finger is a little bit taller than the index finger, right? I don't know. But it's kind of cool, you can be like, right? But again, this is just kind of fun. All right. What about hormones, right? Do hormones have anything to do with sexual orientation? So very interestingly, there is a synthetic hormone called DES that in the 50s was given to women who were pregnant. And interestingly, women, girls who were born to the women who took that are more likely to be gay or bisexual than girls born during the same period of time to women who didn't take that hormonal medication during their pregnancy. Also, remember the girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, right? XX individuals with extra testosterone, they are also more likely than other XX individuals to be gay or bisexual. So there is some evidence to suggest that hormones might play a role in terms of how your sexual orientation gets coded in the brain. There's also, this is a fun one, so the older brother effect. So the more older brothers you have, the more likely, if you're a guy, the more likely you will be gay. And this holds true only if they're biologic brothers. So if they're stepbrothers or adopted brothers or whatever, it doesn't hold true. So it's not just the fact that you're like the youngest, right, of a bunch of guys. And people have hypothesized, we know that the woman, the mother, starts to make some antibodies against her own children, especially with more and more subsequent pregnancies. So there's some hypothesis that the mother's immune system is actually kind of attacking part of the brain in the male fetus that ends up making them gay or something. I don't know. It's interesting. But it's kind of a fun thing. It's like, I wonder what's going to happen with the youngest Jonah brother. I don't know, right? It certainly doesn't mean like you will be gay. You're just a lot more likely to be than the general population. All right, what about genetic stuff? So again, with twin studies, right? So identical twins, if your identical twin is gay, there's a 50% chance that you are too. If you have a non-identical twin, a fraternal twin, you have a 20% chance, right? Versus if you're just siblings who aren't twins, it's an 8% chance that if your sibling is gay, you will be too. And that's about the chance in the general population, right? So there seems to be, again, so the identical twins would hint towards a genetic influence. The non-identical twins would point towards something that happens during pregnancy, maybe, right? The fact that they are, twins, they're in the pregnancy at the same time, that they're more likely than non-twin siblings. Interesting. All right. So at present, right, the data that we have weighs a lot more heavily that there's some sort of innate or biologic cause of sexual orientation rather than it be something that you learned or how you were raised, or certainly it does not seem to be a choice. I know very, very few people that would choose to be gay or lesbian and live a life that is much more difficult in many ways. There are certainly elements of the environment, however, like how you were raised and what you're exposed to, that will impact whether or not you express your homosexuality, right? So if you're living in a culture that devalues or censors it, certainly if you're going to be put to death for it, right, then you may suppress that or attempt to suppress your natural sexual orientation to like survive and get along and be a member of society, right? There was a really prominent LGBT activist in Russia, actually, who was part of their major LGBT organizations, really high profile, very active in trying to get gay rights in Russia. And then he was arrested by their current day equivalent of the KGB, and he was imprisoned for, I think it was 17 months. And he came out of prison and he said, oh, you know what? I'm not gay, actually. So I don't really believe that, right? So there a lot of factors can influence whether or not you express it, right? So the image with the people in the rainbow shirts, right, holding up, they're in a country that will put them to death if it became known that they were gay. So it's pretty brave to stand there even with a piece of paper over your face, actually. All right. And of course, there are places where there's a lot of violence against gay people, even in our own country historically, and sometimes still in some places today, right? So those environmental influences are going to be really quite strong in terms of whether you actually express your sexuality or not. So we have now talked about the development of both gender identity and sexual orientation. So I'm going to skip over the gender identity section on the slide. This is just review for you, right? So remember, so sexual orientation, there can be a range, right? That whole spectrum, that Kinsey scale. And we have a lot of evidence that supports it is kind of biologically determined, that you are kind of wired this way. You may or may not express it depending on your circumstances, but there is no evidence that you can actually change your sexual orientation. And there is evidence that it seems to be due to your brain structure, hormonal exposures, genetic influences, and other things. So that's it for lecture 3. I'll look forward to talking with you again next week.
The single most common question I get asked is, are you a boy or are you a girl? The simple answer is no. But then the response after that is usually a very confused, what? So here is the explanation. I am non-binary, and that means I identify as something other than male or female. Our society and history has led us to believe over thousands of years that there are only people who are male and people who are female. But that is because past society has based gender on physical sex.
Let me see what it is, nurse. Ah, yes, what a strapping young lad.
It's outdated. The truth is that gender is in the brain, and physical sex is a completely separate and different thing that is private to every individual. What people really mean when they're asking the boy or girl question is creepily, so, what genitals do you have? People need to realise it doesn't matter what living meat skeleton you've been born in, it's what you feel that defines you. Non-binary is a blanket term for anyone who identifies out with the binary gender. There are endless ways of being non-binary, and no two people identify in the same way. So just remember, gender is what you feel, not what your parts are. Don't be afraid to be yourself. Bye guys.